It takes exactly 10 seconds to hand a monster a piece of paper that will ruin his life. It takes him exactly 10 minutes to remind you why he's the monster. She didn't scream when she handed the Mafia Boss the divorce papers. He didn't yell when he read them. But 10 minutes later, when she walked to the elevator, the keypad went dead. The stairwell locked. The penthouse became a vault. And she realized you don't divorce a king. You just go to war. The manila envelope sat on the mahogany desk like a loaded gun. Claire stared at it. She traced the frayed edge of the paper with a fingernail bitten down to the quick. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline was a smear of grey and bruised purple, the rain streaking the glass in relentless heavy sheets. The penthouse was silent. It was always silent. A $60 million tomb suspended 80 floors above a city that her husband owned. She heard the heavy thud of the front doors opening. The sound carried down the long, marble-tiled hallway, followed by the low murmur of voices. Damien and his shadow, Paulie. A beat later, heavy footsteps approached the study. Claire didn't stand. She remained in the oversized leather armchair, her knees pulled tight together, her posture rigid. She wore a simple grey sweater and faded denim clothes from before. Clothes that didn't belong in a room, decorated with imported Italian leather and original oil paintings. The heavy oak door swung open. Damien walked in. He looked exactly as he always did, exhausted, immaculate and dangerous. His dark suit was damp at the shoulders from the rain. He was loosening his silk tie with one hand while tossing a burner phone onto a side table with the other. He didn't look at her right away. He walked straight to the wet bar in the corner, grabbed a crystal tumbler, and poured 3 fingers of amber liquid. Traffic on the Kennedy was at a dead stop. He said, his voice, a low, gravelly baritone. He took a sip, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second. Took 2 hours to get back from the docks. Tell me you had a better day. He finally turned to her. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, caught the dim light of the desk lamp. They dropped from her face to the manila envelope, resting in the center of his immaculate blotter. Damien paused. The glass in his hand went perfectly still. He didn't ask what it was. A man who survived 3 assassination attempts and 2 federal indictments didn't ask stupid questions. He walked around the desk, his movements slow, deliberate. He set his drink down. The clink of crystal against wood sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He picked up the envelope. He slid his thumb under the flap, breaking the thin seal, and pulled out the crisp white documents. Claire stopped breathing. She watched his eyes track across the black ink. She waited for the explosion. She waited for the glass to shatter, for the heavy oak desk to be flipped, for the roaring fury that kept the entire Midwestern underworld awake at night. Nothing happened. Damien read the first page, then the second. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying stone. A muscle in his jaw feathered. Once. Twice. He placed the papers back on the desk, aligning them perfectly with the edge of the leather blotter. He picked up his drink, took another slow sip, and leaned against the edge of the mahogany wood, crossing his ankles. Irreconcilable differences, he murmured. The words tasted flat in the heavy air. Yes, Claire said. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat, hating the weakness, and forced herself to meet his gaze. I've signed my portion. My lawyer has copies. Your lawyer, Damien repeated. A ghost of a smirk played at the corner of his mouth, but it didn't reach his eyes. Which lawyer is brave enough to file these, Claire? Tell me his name. I'd like to send him a fruit basket. Don't do that, Damien. She stood up. Her legs felt hollow, but she locked her knees. Don't turn this into a threat. It's over. You know it's over. We haven't been a marriage in 3 years. We're just 2 people haunting the same house. He looked at her. Really looked at her. He took in the faded sweater, the lack of makeup, the dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. The physical toll of loving a man whose life was built on violence. "You want out?" he said quietly. "I want to breathe," she replied. "I want to wake up and not wonder if the man sleeping next to me is going to be arrested or shot, or if I'm going to have to scrub blood out of his cuffs before the maid sees." Damien didn't flinch. He just swirled the liquor in his glass. "I kept you safe. You kept me in a cage." She walked toward the door, stopping just a few feet from him. The scent of him rain-expensive cologne and the sharp metallic tang of cold air made her stomach twist. "I'm leaving Damien. I'm taking a single bag. I don't want your money. I don't want the properties. I just want my name back." Damien stared at her. His pale blue eyes were completely unreadable. "A bag," he said flatly. "Yes." He took a final sip of his scotch, swallowing it down. He set the empty glass on the desk. "Drive safe," he said. Claire blinked. The response was so completely devoid of emotion, it felt like a physical blow. No argument. No bargaining. Just a cold, dismissive release. A sudden pathetic ache bloomed in her chest, the final dying gasp of a 10-year love story, ending with a careless shrug. She swallowed hard, nodding once. "Goodbye, Damien." She turned and walked out of the study. She didn't look back. If she had, she would have seen that Damien wasn't looking at her retreating back. He was looking at the digital security panel mounted on the wall next to his desk. Claire walked down the hallway, her boots sinking into the plush, sound-absorbing carpet. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was too easy. She pushed the thought away. Take the win, she told herself. Just keep walking. She entered the master suite. It was massive, cold, and entirely impersonal. The bed was perfectly made. She ignored the walk-in closet that housed hundreds of thousands of dollars in designer gowns and shoes. Instead, she went to the small leather duffel bag she had packed hours ago, tucked behind a heavy velvet armchair. It held 2 pairs of jeans, a few shirts, her passport, and $3,000 in cash she had been siphoning from grocery runs for 6 months. She slung the strap over her shoulder. It was heavy, but it felt like the lightest thing she had carried in a decade. She walked out of the bedroom, bypassing the massive living room with its panoramic view of the storm outside. She headed straight for the private foyer. The penthouse took up the entire top floor, accessible only by a private elevator that required a thumbprint and a 6-digit code. Claire stepped up to the brushed steel panel. She pressed her thumb to the glass reader. Beep. The small LED screen flashed green. She typed in her code. 140988. Nothing happened. Claire frowned. She wiped her thumb on her sweater and pressed it to the glass again. Green light. She punched the numbers in harder. The screen blinked. Then the green light shifted to a hard, solid crimson. Access denied. A cold prickle of dread started at the base of her neck. She pressed the glass again. Access denied. System glitch, she muttered out loud, though her voice shook. She turned away from the elevator and walked briskly toward the fire exit at the end of the hall. By city ordinance, it couldn't be locked from the inside. She reached the heavy steel door. She grabbed the crash bar and leaned her weight into it. It didn't move. Claire shoved harder, her boots slipping slightly on the polished marble floor. "Come on!" she hissed. She hit the metal bar with the heel of her hand. The heavy, immovable dullness of solid steel echoed back at her. She looked up. Above the doorframe, a thick, rectangular magnetic lock was bolted to the metal. A small, unblinking red light glowed ominously in the dim hallway. Engaged. The air in her lungs felt suddenly thin. She turned around. The silence of the penthouse pressed in on her, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't a glitch. The building's security system was hardwired into the mainframe, controlled exclusively by the panel in Damien's study. 10 minutes. It had been exactly 10 minutes since she handed him the papers. Her hand started to shake. The fear she had kept suppressed for weeks bubbled up, acidic and sharp, but it was quickly swallowed by a sudden, blinding surge of anger. The audacity. The absolute, arrogant control. She dropped her duffel bag on the floor. It hit the marble with a heavy thud. Claire marched back down the hallway, her boots clicking loudly now, entirely devoid of hesitation. She crossed the living room, ignoring the storm raging against the glass, and headed straight back to the heavy oak doors of the study. They were closed. She didn't knock. She grabbed the brass handle, turned it, and shoved the door open. Damien hadn't moved. He was still standing by the desk, leaning against the edge, ankles crossed. He had poured himself a second drink. The manila envelope was still sitting perfectly square on the leather blotter. He looked up as she stormed in. His expression was completely blank. "The elevator is locked," Claire said, her voice tight, vibrating with a rage she was desperately trying to control. "I know," Damien said. He took a sip of his scotch. "The fire escape is sealed." "I know." "Unlock the doors, Damien." He looked at the amber liquid in his glass, watching the way the desk lamp refracted through the crystal. "No." The single syllable hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Claire stared at him. She felt the blood rushing in her ears. "You can't do this. You can't just lock me in here." "I just did." Damien finally looked at her. His eyes were no longer washed out. They were dark, focused, and terrifyingly clear. "You handed me a piece of paper, Claire. A piece of paper that says you want to dissolve a legal contract. That's fine. The lawyers can fight over the assets, but you are not walking out that door." "That is kidnapping." Damien let out a short, cynical bark of laughter. It was a harsh, scraping sound. "Kidnapping, Claire, look around. You're in your own home. The storm outside is severe. The system automatically locked down for our safety. A tragic malfunction." "Stop it!" Claire yelled. The sudden volume of her own voice shocked her, but she didn't care. She crossed the room, stopping inches from him. She could smell the scotch on his breath, see the faint stubble on his jaw. "Stop talking to me like I'm one of your soldiers. I am your wife." "Exactly." Damien's voice dropped, dropping an octave, losing the cynical edge, and replacing it with something infinitely more dangerous. "You are my wife. Mine. You don't get to just pack a bag and take an Uber to a motel in the suburbs. You don't get to resign from this life. I am drowning in this life." She pointed a trembling finger at the desk. "You think I want to leave? You think this is easy? I haven't slept through the night in 4 years, Damien. Every time the phone rings, my stomach drops. Every time you walk through that door, I check your hands to see whose blood is on them. I have never brought the violence into this house." He countered, his voice cold iron. "The violence is this house." Claire stepped closer, her chest heaving. "It's the cameras in the ceiling. It's the 4 men with guns who follow me to the dry cleaners. It's the fact that I don't have friends, Damien, because I'm terrified that your enemies will find out their names and use them to get to you. I am a ghost. I live in a $60 million graveyard." Damien's jaw tightened. He set the glass down. Slowly, he uncrossed his arms and stood up to his full height. He was a head taller than her, broad and imposing, a physical reality of the threat he posed to the rest of the world. He stepped into her space. Claire didn't back away. "You think the outside world is safer?" he asked quietly, his voice a low rumble. "You think if you walk out that door, you magically become Jane Doe? You think the Russians forget who you are. You think the feds delete your file. I'll disappear. You can't. He reached up. Claire flinched a microscopic twitch, but she forced herself to stand still. He didn't hit her. He gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers were warm, his touch startlingly tender against the violent context of their conversation. You are Claire Costa. You carry my name. That makes you a target the second you step off my property without my protection. Then let me go. She whispered, a sudden wave of exhaustion hitting her. Let me go and protect me from afar. Put your men in the shadows. But let me live. No. The word was softer this time, but infinitely heavier. Why? A tear broke free, hot and angry, tracking down her cheek. She didn't bother wiping it away. If you don't love me anymore, if we don't even talk, why are you doing this? Damien's hand dropped from her hair to her jaw, his thumb brushing away the tear. His eyes were entirely focused on hers, stripping away the cold, detached mob boss and revealing the fractured, obsessive man underneath. Who said I don't love you? He murmured. You don't show it. I show it every day you're alive. He leaned in closer, his forehead almost touching hers. I built an empire so no one could ever touch you. I slaughtered men who looked at you too long. I bought this city so you could walk its streets like a queen. You think love is flowers and dates, Claire. My love is a fortress, and I am not letting you tear it down. It's a prison, she choked out. Call it what you want. Damien stepped back, the tender moment evaporating as quickly as it had arrived. He picked up his drink again. He was in control. He was back in his element. The elevators stay locked. The stairs stay sealed. You have the run of the penthouse. Paulie will drop off groceries in the security vestibule. If you want to scream, scream. If you want to break the china, break it. But you are not leaving this floor. Claire stared at him, the reality of her situation settling into her bones like lead. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for threats. She hadn't prepared for a siege. You can't keep me here forever, she said, her voice shaking, losing its conviction. Damien looked at the manila envelope on his desk. He reached out, picked it up, and walked over to the small stone fireplace in the corner of the study. He flicked a silver lighter, touched the flame to the corner of the paper, and watched it catch. He dropped the burning envelope onto the cold stone hearth. Watch me, he said. 72 hours. That was how long it took for the sheer scale of her confinement to break through the adrenaline. Claire had spent the first day in a blur of manic, futile energy. She threw a heavy brass bookend at the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room. It bounced off the reinforced bulletproof glass with a pathetic thud, leaving a shallow scratch that the housekeeper Maria, who no longer came, would have buffed out in seconds. She ripped the landline out of the wall. She found the router in the utility closet and smashed it with the heel of a riding boot, only to discover a secondary hard-wired network kicked in immediately, routing all communications directly to Damien's encrypted server. She was a ghost, haunting a digital fortress. By the third day, the silence became a physical weight. The penthouse, usually a place she merely existed within, expanded into an endless geography of dead space. Damien did not leave. He orchestrated his empire from the study. The heavy oak doors left ajar just enough for her to hear the low, steady rumble of his voice on international calls. He spoke in rapid Italian, sharp Russian, and flattened, emotionless English. He was managing shipments, authorizing violence, moving millions of dollars, all while entirely trapped in the same cage she was. He acted as if nothing had changed, and that was what truly drove her mad. Every morning, at exactly 7, he emerged from the guest bedroom he had claimed. He wore a crisp dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, dark trousers, and a shoulder holster. He made coffee in the kitchen. He poured 2 cups. He left hers on the marble island. Every morning, Claire watched from the hallway shadows as the steam rose from the porcelain mug. Every morning, she waited until he returned to his study before she walked into the kitchen, picked up the mug, and poured the expensive dark roast down the stainless steel sink. The only proof the outside world still existed was the security vestibule. It was a small airlocked chamber between the private elevator and the front doors of the penthouse. At noon every day the inner door locked. The elevator chimed. Heavy footsteps poorlies echoed in the small space. The rustle of paper bags, the soft thud of a heavy box setting down. Then the elevator doors closed, the outer lock engaged, and the inner door clicked open. On the 4th day, Claire stood by the vestibule waiting for the click. When it sounded, she opened the door. 3 brown paper bags sat on the floor. Groceries. The staples she usually bought alongside things she never asked for. Fresh peonies. A box of truffles from a shop in the Gold Coast. She stared at the flowers. Their bright pink petals looked obscenely cheerful against the cold grey slate of the floor. Damien appeared at the end of the hall. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a shadow against the recessed lighting, watching her. Claire bent down. She picked up the bags with the bread, the milk, the produce. She left the flowers and the chocolate on the floor. She walked past him to the kitchen, her shoulder grazing his chest, and began putting the food away. The hum of the sub-zero refrigerator was the only sound between them. The Greeks are demanding a higher percentage on the port shipments, Damien said, his voice casual, as if he were discussing the weather. He leaned against the island, watching her aggressively shove a carton of eggs onto a shelf. I told them if they halt the cargo, I'll sink their barges in the channel. Claire slammed the refrigerator door. She turned to him, gripping the edge of the marble counter until her knuckles turned white. I don't care about the Greeks, Damien, she said, her voice a low, raspy hiss. I don't care about the port. I don't care about your money. You used to listen, he noted. I used to think you were just a businessman with rough edges, she shot back. I was 22 and stupid. Now I know you're just a thug in a $5,000 suit. A muscle twitched in his jaw. The insult landed, but he absorbed it, his face smoothing over into that terrifying blank mask. Dinner is at 8, he said. I'd rather eat glass. I'll have Paulie send up some shards with tomorrow's delivery. Damien pushed off the counter. 8 o'clock, Claire. At the table. He walked away. Claire stood in the kitchen, her chest heaving, fighting the sudden childish urge to scream until her throat bled. She didn't. She waited until 8 o'clock, took a plate of cold cuts, and locked herself in the master bathroom. She sat on the heated tile floor, eating in the dark, listening to the muffled clinking of silver against china from the dining room down the hall. He was eating alone, at a table built for 12. She was eating on a bathroom floor. The attrition was mutual. They were both bleeding out. He was just pretending he didn't feel the wound. The illusion of total control cracked on the 8th day. It happened at 2:14 a.m. Claire was awake. Sleep had become a fractured, elusive thing. She lay in the center of the massive, king-sized bed, staring at the shadows playing across the vaulted ceiling. Outside the city was unnervingly quiet, a thick layer of fog rolling off Lake Michigan and swallowing the skyscrapers below them. Then the low hum of the penthouse's HVAC system abruptly died. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. A second later, the digital clock on the nightstand went black. The ambient light from the hallway vanished. Power outage. Claire sat up, pulling the duvet to her chest. The building had 3 redundant backup generators. They were supposed to kick in seamlessly within a millisecond of grid failure. 10 seconds passed. The dark remained absolute. A mechanical clank echoed through the walls. It was heavy metallic and deep within the building's core. The magnetic locks. When the system lost all auxiliary power, the fire safety protocols demanded the magnetic locks disengage. The cage door was open. Claire threw off the covers. Her bare feet hit the cold hardwood. She didn't grab her bag. She didn't grab shoes. She just moved, driven by pure, unadulterated instinct. She bolted out of the master suite, navigating the pitch-black hallway by memory, running her hand along the silk wallpaper to keep her bearings. She reached the foyer. The heavy steel fire door at the end of the hall was a darker rectangle against the gloom. She slammed her hands against the crash bar. It gave. The door creaked open, spilling the stale, dusty air of the concrete stairwell into the luxurious hallway. She had done it. She was out. A hand clamped over her mouth. Claire screamed against a leather-gloved palm, her limbs thrashing violently. A solid, immovable arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet. She kicked back her bare heel, connecting with a solid shin, but the body behind her didn't even flinch. "Quiet," a voice hissed in her ear. "Damien." He dropped her to the floor instantly, pushing her against the wall behind a thick marble pillar. She gasped for air, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. He was wearing dark tactical pants and a black t-shirt. Even in the dark, she could see the dull matte finish of the suppressed pistol in his right hand. "They cut the hard lines in the basement," Damien whispered, his voice barely a breath. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were scanning the open fire door. "Generators are dead. It's an inside job. Someone gave them the schematic." "Who?" Claire breathed terror instantly, overriding her anger. "Doesn't matter right now." Damien reached into the waistband of his pants, pulled out a smaller, compact handgun, and shoved it into her hands. The metal was heavy and freezing cold. "Safety is off. Point and pull. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me, you empty the magazine into their chest. Do you understand?" "Damien, I can't." "Do you understand me, Claire?" His pale eyes locked onto hers in the gloom. There was no husband looking at her now. It was the apex predator cornered in his den. "Yes," she whispered. He didn't wait. He moved away from the pillar, silent as smoke, sliding toward the open fire door. Claire pressed her back against the marble, gripping the gun with both hands. Her finger rested dangerously close to the trigger. The silence was agonizing. The fog outside pressed against the windows, rendering the city a pale, ghostly void. A scuff of a boot on concrete. Not Damien's. It came from the stairwell. Slow, methodical. A shadow separated itself from the darkness of the open doorway. It was a man large, wearing a tactical vest and carrying a shortened assault rifle. He stepped into the foyer, his weapon raised, sweeping the area. Claire stopped breathing. The intruder took a step toward the living room, passing the pillar. A muffled pft-pft broke the quiet. The man jerked forward as two hollow-point rounds took him in the side of the neck. He didn't even have time to cry out. He collapsed onto the marble floor with a heavy, wet thud, his rifle clattering uselessly away. Damien stepped out from the shadows of the stairwell. He didn't check the body. He immediately pivoted, aiming his weapon up the concrete stairs. "Clear the floor!" a voice shouted from a floor below, echoing up the shaft. "Move, move!" Back to the study, Damien ordered, grabbing Claire by the bicep and hauling her up. "Now!" They ran. Behind them, the stairwell erupted in chaos. The deafening roar of unsuppressed gunfire shattered the silence, the bullets chewing into the plaster and marble of the foyer. The walls exploded in clouds of white dust. Damien shoved her into his study, slamming the heavy oak door shut and throwing the manual deadbolt. It wouldn't hold them long, but it bought seconds. He moved to the large mahogany desk, hauling it backward. The massive piece of furniture groaned against the floorboards as he pushed it against the doors to barricade them. "Get in the safe," he barked, pointing to the open steel vault hidden behind a massive oil painting. "I'm not leaving you out here," she said, her voice shaking. "Get in the damn safe, Claire." The oak doors shuddered violently as something heavy slammed against them from the hallway. "No," she yelled back. She raised the small handgun, aiming it directly at the door. "You said we're in this together. Prove it." Damien looked at her. For a fraction of a second, surprise flickered across his face. Then the oak doors splintered inward, the heavy wood groaning under the force of a battering ram, and the world dissolved into noise and fire. The gunfight lasted less than 60 seconds, but it felt like hours. The oak doors gave way. The desk pushed back a foot, leaving a gap just wide enough for a man to slip through. The first intruder tried. Damien shot him through the wood before he even crossed the threshold. The second man was smarter. He threw a flashbang through the gap. "Down!" Damien roared, tackling Claire to the floor behind the heavy leather sofa. The grenade detonated. A blinding flash of magnesium-white light seared Claire's retinas, followed instantly by a concussive boom that sucked the air from her lungs and left a high-pitched, agonizing ring in her ears. Disoriented, coughing through the acrid smoke, she felt Damien move. He stood up, leaning over the sofa, firing blindly into the smoke-filled doorway. Return fire chewed the leather upholstery inches from Claire's head, showering her in foam and synthetic stuffing. She heard a grunt, a wet, heavy sound of impact. Damien stumbled backward, dropping to one knee. He kept firing, his hand steady, even as his body faltered. He emptied the magazine, the slide locking back with a sharp click. Silence descended again, heavy and thick with the smell of cordite and burned carpet. From the hallway, nothing moved. A low groan came from the man trapped in the doorway, followed by the wet, gurgling sound of a lung filling with blood. Then stillness. Claire crawled out from behind the sofa. Her ears were ringing so loudly she could barely hear her own breath. The emergency red lighting in the study cast a hellish glow over the destruction. The priceless oil paintings were shredded. The mahogany desk was splintered. Damien was sitting on the floor, leaning heavily against the wall next to the fireplace. His gun was resting on his thigh. His left hand was clamped tightly over his right side, just beneath the ribs. Thick, dark blood was seeping between his fingers, staining the pristine white of his shirt. Claire froze. The pistol in her own hand suddenly felt like a lead weight. This was it. The door was broken. The men in the hall were dead. Damien was bleeding out on the floor. All she had to do was drop the gun, walk out, and take the stairs. She had $3,000 in her bag. She could vanish into the fog before the police even figured out how to bypass the street-level gates. Damien looked up at her. His face was pale, sheened with cold sweat, but his eyes were clear. He read the hesitation in her posture. He read the calculation in her eyes. He didn't ask for help. He didn't beg. He simply leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes, and exhaled a long, ragged breath. "Go," he rasped. The word hit her harder than the physical blow of the blast. Claire stared at the open doorway. Freedom was right there. It smelled like gunpowder and copper, but it was real. She took a step toward the hall. Damien let out a low, involuntary hiss of pain, pressing his hand harder against his ribs. Claire stopped. She closed her eyes, cursing herself, cursing the twisted, complicated knots in her chest that bound her to a man she desperately wanted to hate. 10 years. 10 years of holding his hand in the dark. 10 years of knowing the exact shape of the scar on his chin and the way he took his coffee. You can hate the monster, but what happens when you're the only one who knows how to keep the monster breathing? She threw the gun onto the ruined sofa. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Move your hand." Damien opened his eyes. Surprise, genuine and unmasked, softened the hard lines of his face. "Claire." "Shut up and move your hand." She snapped her hands, shaking, as she ripped the fabric of his shirt open, popping the buttons. The wound was ugly. A ragged, dark hole just above his hip bone. It was bleeding sluggishly, a thick arterial flow that was terrifyingly steady. "It's a through and through." Damien grunted, his teeth gritted. "Missed the liver, I think." "You think?" Claire pressed her palms directly against the wound, applying brutal, heavy pressure. Damien's entire body went rigid, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His free hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with crushing force, his survival instincts fighting her help. "Let go!" she commanded, glaring down at him. He stared at her, his chest heaving, his grip on her wrist bruising. Slowly, agonizingly, his fingers uncurled. He let his hand drop to the floor. He was surrendering to her. "In the safe," he whispered, his head lolling slightly to the side. "Bottom drawer. Trauma kit." Claire kept one hand clamped over the wound, reaching backward with her other, to grab a heavy linen throw pillow from a nearby armchair. She shoved it hard against his side. "Hold this." "Press it hard." He weakly placed his hand over the pillow. Claire scrambled to the open safe. She bypassed the stacks of cash, the velvet boxes of diamonds, and the leather-bound ledgers. She found the black canvas bag at the bottom, dragged it out, and brought it back to him. She ripped open the zipper. Inside were combat-grade medical supplies, Kellogg's gauze pressure bandages, surgical staples, saline. The toolkit of a man who fully expected to bleed in his own home. She tore open a pack of hemostatic gauze. "This is going to burn." "Do it," he muttered. She packed the wound, forcing the chemical-laced fabric deep into the bullet hole to clot the bleeding. Damien didn't scream. He bit down on his lower lip until it bled, his head thrown back against the wall, the cords in his neck standing out like steel cables. Claire worked quickly, mechanically, pushing down the rising bile in her throat. She wrapped a tight pressure bandage around his torso, securing it tightly. Her hands were slick with his blood. It was under her fingernails. It stained the cuffs of her sweater. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, exhausted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Damien was pale, but the bleeding had slowed significantly. He turned his head to look at her. His eyes tracked down to her bloody hands, and then up to her face. "You stayed," he said softly. "Don't flatter yourself." Claire lied, her voice hollow. "If you die, your men will think I did it." "I wouldn't make it to the lobby." Damien didn't argue. He just watched her, his expression unreadable in the dim red emergency light. He reached out slowly, his large, calloused hand hovering in the air, before gently wrapping around her bloody fingers. "Thank you," he said. Claire stared at their joined hands. The blood on his palm mixed with the blood on hers. It felt like a sick, twisted parody of a wedding vow. She tried to pull her hand away, but his grip, though weak, was relentless. "The power will be back in 10 minutes, Damien whispered, closing his eyes again, his thumb lightly stroking her knuckles. "My men are already on their way up. The lockdown will re-engage." He was telling her that her window was closing. The cage was about to be locked again. Claire looked at the shattered doorway, at the bodies in the hall, and finally down at the broken, bleeding king of the Chicago underworld who refused to let her go. She didn't run. She sat on the floor among the ruins of her gilded cage, covered in his blood, and waited for the locks to click. The power returned with a deafening mechanical hum. The emergency red lighting flickered and died, replaced instantly by the harsh, unforgiving glare of the halogen track lights in the hallway. The sudden brightness was violent. It stripped away the shadows, exposing the carnage in high definition. The heavy oak doors were splintered wood and twisted hinges. The antique Persian rug was soaked in a dark, spreading stain, and the silence was broken by the sharp electronic chirp of the security system rebooting. The heavy steel fire doors at the end of the hall slammed shut. The magnetic locks engaged with a heavy final clack. The cage was sealed. A minute later, the private elevator chimed. Claire flinched, pulling her knees to her chest where she sat on the floor beside Damien. She didn't reach for the gun. She didn't have the energy. She just stared at the elevator doors. They slid open, and 4 men poured out, weapons drawn, sweeping the foyer with ruthless efficiency. Paulie was in the lead. He wore a rumpled trench coat over pajamas, his face a tight mask of lethal focus. He took in the dead bodies in the hall without breaking stride, his eyes locking onto the ruined study. "Boss," Paulie barked, stepping over a corpse and lowering his weapon. "I'm here," Damien grunted. His voice was thin, strained through layers of pain. The men flooded the room. The transition was immediate and jarring. 1 second it was just Claire and a dying Matten. The next, the penthouse became a command center. Radios crackled. Orders were shouted in short, clipped Italian. 2 men immediately grabbed the bodies in the hall by the ankles, dragging them toward the service elevator. They left wide, wet streaks of crimson across the marble. Paulie dropped to his knees beside Damien, peeling back the blood-soaked sweater and the hastily applied pressure bandage. He swore softly. "Call Evans," Paulie said over his shoulder to a man by the door. "Tell him to bring the kit for a through and through, and tell him if he takes longer than 15 minutes, I'm shooting him in the kneecaps." "I'm fine," Damien rasped, slapping Paulie's hand away. Perimeter is locked down. We have 12 men downstairs, 6 in the lobby. The street is cordoned off. The cops on the payroll are rerouting the 911 calls regarding the gunfire." Paulie looked at Claire. His eyes dropped to her blood-stained hands, then to the discarded pistol on the sofa, and finally back to her face. There was a flicker of something in Paulie's eyes. Respect. It was a terrifying thing to earn. "You did good, Mrs. Costa," Paulie said quietly. Claire didn't answer. She stood up. Her legs felt like lead, her joints stiff and aching from the adrenaline crash. She looked down at herself. Her favorite grey sweater was stiff with drying blood. Her fingernails were caked in it. "Get her out of here." Damien ordered, his eyes tracking her as she swayed slightly. "Put a man on the bedroom door." "No." The word slipped out of Claire before she could stop it. The room went entirely still. The men dragging the bodies paused. Paulie looked up. Damien's pale eyes narrowed. "Claire!" Damien warned, the steel returning to his voice despite his blood loss. "Go to the bedroom. Let them work. I am not sitting in a bedroom while strangers scrub my husband's blood out of the floorboards," she said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. The hysteria had burned away, leaving nothing but cold, hard clarity. "This is my house. I'll stay right here." She walked over to the ruined leather sofa, picked up the pistol she had dropped, and placed it carefully on the side table. Then she sat down on the one cushion that wasn't covered in plaster dust or foam. She crossed her legs. Damien stared at her. He didn't argue. He just let his head fall back against the wall, a tight, grim smile playing on his bloodless lips, before he closed his eyes. Dr. Evans arrived 12 minutes later. He was a small, balding man with a nervous twitch and a black medical bag that cost more than a luxury car. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask why there was a bullet hole in the wall or why the air smelled like cordite. He knelt beside Damien on the floor. "I need him on the desk or a table." "He stays on the floor," Claire said from the sofa. "If you move him, he'll bleed out faster. Work there." Evans blinked, looking at Claire, then to Paulie for confirmation. Paulie nodded once. For the next hour, Claire watched. She watched as Evans injected local anesthetic directly into the ragged wound. She watched as he irrigated the tissue with saline, flushing out fragments of the hollow point, round and torn fabric. She watched Damien bite down on a leather belt, his body rigid sweat pouring down his face as the doctor sutured the torn muscle and skin. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. Down the hall, the sounds of cleanup continued. The heavy slosh of mop buckets, the sharp chemical sting of industrial bleach masking the copper scent of blood, the heavy thud of bodies being rolled into thick plastic tarp. It was a machine, a well-oiled, terrifying machine designed to erase violence as quickly as it was committed. She had lived adjacent to this machine for 10 years. She had spent a decade pretending it didn't exist, willfully ignoring the late-night phone calls and the sudden disappearances. She wasn't ignoring it anymore. She was sitting in the middle of the gears. When Evans finished, he taped a heavy gauze pad over Damien's side. He left antibiotics, painkillers, and a list of instructions that Paulie shoved into his pocket. "He needs rest," Evans muttered, packing his bag. "If the fever spikes, call me. Otherwise, I don't want to see him for a week." Paulie escorted the doctor out. 2 men helped Damien off the floor. He grunted his face, turning an ashen grey, but he refused to let them carry him. He leaned heavily on one of the soldiers, limping toward the hallway. He stopped in front of the sofa. He looked down at Claire. "Are you satisfied?" he asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I'll let you know when the bleach smell fades," she replied flatly. Damien gave a slow, measured nod. He turned and let his men help him down the hall. Claire sat in the ruined study for another hour. She watched the men finish scrubbing the floor. She watched them carry out the splintered remains of the heavy oak doors. When the room was finally empty, stripped of everything but the desk, the sofa, and the lingering smell of chemicals, she stood up. She walked to the bathroom. She turned on the shower, the water scalding hot. She stepped in, fully clothed. She stood under the spray for a long time, watching the water turn pink, then red, then clear as it circled the drain. She had tried to leave. She had failed. And in failing, she had accidentally unlocked a door inside herself that she could never close again. 3 days later, the penthouse was a fortress, holding its breath. New oak doors had been installed in the study. The Persian rug was gone, replaced by a dark, austere hardwood floor. The bullet holes in the walls had been spackled and painted. To an outsider, the violence had never happened, but the atmosphere inside the $60 million tomb had shifted fundamentally. Damien didn't stay in bed. Against Evans's strict orders, he was back in his study by the second morning. He sat rigidly in his leather chair, a glass of water, replacing his usual Scotch-popping prescription painkillers with the mechanical regularity of a clock ticking. He was hunting. The attack wasn't a random hit. The attackers had bypassed the street-level security, disabled the hardwired generators in the sub-basement, and known exactly which fire exit to breach. They had the building schematics. They had the patrol schedules. Someone inside Damien's inner circle had sold him to the wolves. Claire did not return to her routine. She didn't retreat to the living room with a book. She didn't ignore the low murmurs of men in dark suits, coming and going. Instead, she dragged a high-backed reading chair from the library and placed it in the corner of the study. Damien hadn't stopped her. When she first carried the heavy chair into the room, Paulie had moved to intercept her, but Damien had raised a single bandaged hand. Let her stay. So she stayed. She sat in the corner, her legs crossed, a cup of black coffee in her hands, and she watched the king dismantle his own court. It wasn't the Greeks, Damien said on the third afternoon. He was staring at a corkboard Paulie had wheeled in, covered in photographs and red string. The Greeks are brutal, but they're not surgical. This was surgical. This was an assassination. The Russians, Paulie suggested, leaning against the doorframe. No. Damien shifted in his chair, a wince tight in his jaw. The Russians would have sent 20 men, not 4. They would have burned the building down. This was someone who wanted me dead, but wanted the infrastructure intact. Someone who wanted to take over. Claire took a sip of her coffee. Who has the security codes for the sub-basement? Both men stopped. They turned to look at her. It was the first time she had spoken during their strategy sessions. Paulie looked uncomfortable. Damien's eyes, however, sharpened. 3 people, Damien said slowly. Me, Paulie, and Thomas. Thomas, Claire repeated. Thomas was the head of physical security, a former Marine, cold efficient, entirely humorless. He had been with Damien for 5 years. He was the one who oversaw the guards that trailed Claire to the grocery store. Thomas is loyal, Paulie said defensively. He took a bullet for you in Detroit, boss. Loyalty has an expiration date, Paulie, Damien murmured, leaning back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Claire. Usually around the time weakness is perceived. You weren't weak, Paulie argued. I wasn't focused. Damien's pale eyes didn't leave Claire's face. The men notice things. They notice when the boss locks down the penthouse. They notice when the wife stops leaving the floor. They notice when the domestic staff is dismissed. Thomas saw a distraction. He saw a man fighting a war inside his own house, and he decided to open the gates to an outside buyer. Claire felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Because of me. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her rebellion, her desperate attempt for a divorce, had created the exact vulnerability that almost got them both killed. She set her coffee cup down. Bring him up here. Paulie stared at her, as if she had sprouted a second head. He looked at Damien. Damien's face was unreadable. You heard my wife, Paulie. Bring Thomas up. 30 minutes later, the heavy oak doors opened. Thomas was a large man, built like a brick wall, with close-cropped hair and a stoic expression. 2 of Paulie's men flanked him. They hadn't disarmed him yet. They hadn't accused him. This was merely a summons to the boss's office. Thomas stepped into the room. He looked at Damien sitting behind the desk. Then he looked at Claire sitting in the corner. A faint flicker of surprise crossed his rigid features before he masked it. Boss, Thomas said, nodding respectfully. You asked for me. Damien didn't speak. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the manila envelope, the one with the burn mark on the corner, the divorce papers. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a soft smack. My wife and I have been having a disagreement, Damien said, his voice eerily calm. It's caused some tension in the household. I'm sure you noticed. Thomas stood perfectly still. It's not my place to notice your personal life, sir. But you do. Damien leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, ignoring the pain in his side. Because your job is to secure this perimeter. To know every variable. And a distracted boss is a massive variable. I secure the perimeter, sir. The perimeter holds. It didn't hold 3 nights ago, Thomas. That was a coordinated breach. They hit the grid. It was an anomaly. An anomaly, Damien smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow thing. Paulie pulled the access logs for the sub-basement server. The physical logs, not the digital ones. The digital logs were wiped during the blackout, but the physical keypad on the server room door has a memory chip. It registers every key press. Thomas's jaw tightened. Just a fraction. A microscopic shift in the muscles of his neck. Claire saw it. She didn't look away. Your code, Thomas, Damien said softly. Entered 2 hours before the blackout. You went down there. You wired a bypass to the generator logic board. When the grid dropped, the generators didn't fire because you told them not to. Sir, I was conducting a routine check. Who paid you? Damien cut him off. The false calm vanished, replaced by the roaring absolute authority of the Mafia Don. The temperature in the room plummeted. Thomas realized he was trapped. He looked at the 2 men flanking him. He calculated the distance to the door. He calculated the draw speed of his weapon. Don't, Paulie warned, stepping into the room and drawing his own sidearm in a fluid, blindingly fast motion, aiming it directly at the back of Thomas's head. Thomas slowly raised his hands, surrendering to the inevitable. He didn't look at Damien. He looked at Claire. The stoic, respectful guard was gone. The eyes that stared back at her were filled with pure, cynical disgust. You want to know who paid me? Thomas sneered. The Moretti family. They saw blood in the water. They knew Costa was losing his edge. He's been losing it for a year. Watch your mouth, Paulie snapped. He's soft. Thomas spat, his voice echoing in the quiet study. He pointed a thick finger at Claire. He built an empire and he's letting it rot because he's obsessed with a woman who hates his guts. You lock her in here. You put half your detail on watching her so she doesn't run away. You're a joke, Damien. The whole city knows it. You're not a boss anymore. You're just a desperate husband. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every word Thomas spoke was a nail hammered into the coffin of Claire's guilt. He was right. Damien's obsession with her had blinded him. Her hatred of him had weakened him. They were a poison killing each other, and it was spilling out into the streets. Damien didn't yell. He didn't grab his gun. He looked at Thomas with an expression of profound, chilling emptiness. Take him down to the docks, Damien told Paulie. His voice was a flat line. Understood. And Paulie, yeah, boss. Make sure he has a long time to think about his career choices before he goes in the water. Thomas didn't beg. He knew the rules. He just maintained his glare on Claire as Paulie's men dragged him backward out of the study. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the room once again. Claire and Damien were alone. The silence stretched for 10 minutes. The only sound was the heavy rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Damien sat behind his desk. He stared at the burned manila envelope. The pain medication was wearing off. A sheen of cold sweat glistened on his forehead, and his breathing was shallow, tight with the agony in his side. Claire stood up from her chair. She walked slowly across the room, her boots clicking softly on the hardwood. She stopped in front of the desk. She reached out and picked up the envelope. Damien watched her, his pale blue eyes tracking her hands. He didn't try to stop her. He looked defeated. For the first time in 10 years, the indestructible Don of Chicago looked like a broken man. Thomas's words had stripped away the armor, exposing the raw, ugly truth of their marriage. He was right, Damien said quietly. He didn't look up. I let my focus slip. I put you above the family, above the business, and it cost me my men. It almost cost you your life. Claire stared at the heavy paper in her hands. You handed me these papers, Damien continued, his voice rough, scraping against his throat. And my first thought wasn't about the optics or the assets or the risk. My first thought was that I would rather burn the city to the ground than let you walk out that door. He finally looked up at her, his eyes shining with a dark, terrifying vulnerability. That makes me a liability. To my men. And to you. He reached into the top drawer of his desk. He pulled out a small black plastic fob, the master override for the penthouse security system. He slid it across the smooth mahogany surface. It stopped inches from Claire's hand. "Take it," Damien whispered. "The elevator will work. The stairs will open. The accounts in Zurich are in your name. You have enough to disappear. I won't follow you. I won't send men after you. You're free." Claire looked at the black fob. It was exactly what she had wanted. It was the key to her cage. It was the deep breath she had been craving for 3 years. She could pack her duffel bag, walk into the elevator, and take an Uber to O'Hare. By midnight, she could be in Paris. By tomorrow, she could be a ghost. She reached out her hand. Her fingers brushed the cool plastic of the fob. She picked it up. Damien closed his eyes. A muscle feathered in his jaw, the only sign of the absolute agony tearing through him, an agony that had nothing to do with the bullet wound in his side. Claire held the fob in her palm. She felt its weight. She thought about Jane Doe. She thought about a quiet life in a quiet suburb, looking over her shoulder every time a black SUV drove past. She thought about being safe and bored and entirely alone. Then she looked at the man sitting in front of her. He was a monster. He ordered deaths with a casual wave of his hand. He had locked her in a vault to force her submission. He was a tyrant, a criminal, a force of violent nature. But he had also thrown himself over her body when the grenade went off. He had bled on the floor, ready to die so she could run. She had tried to leave the darkness, but the darkness had already seeped into her bones. She didn't recoil from the violence anymore. She had sat in a chair and ordered a man to his execution. She was Claire Costa. The realization settled over her not with fear, but with a terrifying, absolute clarity. She didn't want to leave the cage. She just wanted the keys. Claire tossed the black fob. It didn't go into her pocket. It sailed over the desk over Damien's shoulder and landed with a sharp clatter in the stone hearth of the fireplace. Damien's eyes snapped open. He stared at her confusion, warring with shock. "You don't get to let me go," Claire said, her voice dropping an octave, losing all the frantic desperation it had carried a week ago. It was smooth, cold. It sounded exactly like his. "Claire, shut up," she commanded. Damien's mouth clicked shut. She placed her hands flat on the desk, leaning in close, forcing him to meet her gaze. Thomas was right about one thing. You are losing your edge. Because you're trying to play 2 games at once. You're trying to be a ruthless king to them, and a protective husband to me. You put me in a glass box and thought I wouldn't notice the cracks. She picked up the manila envelope containing the divorce papers. With a swift, vicious motion, she tore it directly down the middle. The thick paper ripped loudly in the quiet room. She tore it again and again, dropping the shredded pieces onto the desk like snow. "I am not a pet. Damien," she said, her voice vibrating with intent. "I am not a liability. I am your wife. And if I am going to stay in this house, if I am going to carry your name, I will never sit in the dark again." Damien stared at the shredded papers on his desk. He looked up at her, his pale eyes wide, the breath hitching in his chest. "What are you saying?" he whispered. "I'm saying the cage is gone," Claire told him, stepping around the desk. She stood beside his chair. She reached down her fingers, grazing his jawline, forcing him to look up into her eyes. No more locked doors. No more secrets. If you go to war, I know the battle plans. If someone betrays us, I sign the order with you. She leaned in her lips, inches from his ear, her voice a silken threat. You want me to be a Costa? Then treat me like a Costa. I am your equal. I am your partner. And if you ever try to lock me in a room again for my own good, I won't hand you divorce papers. I will put a bullet in your other side. She pulled back. Damien was staring at her, transfixed. The broken, defeated man from 10 minutes ago was gone. In his place, a slow, dark fire ignited in his eyes. It was a terrifying, consuming awe. He was looking at her not as a possession, but as a queen who had just claimed her throne. He reached up his large hand, wrapping around her wrist, pulling her hand down from his jaw to press his lips fiercely against her palm. "Whatever you want," he promised, his voice rough with a twisted, absolute devotion. "My empire, my blood, it's yours." "Good," Claire said. She pulled her hand back. She walked over to the side table, picked up the burner phone Damien had tossed there days ago, and threw it into his lap. "Call Paulie," she ordered, walking toward the study doors. "Tell him to secure the docks, and tell him I want the Moretti family's shipping routes mapped out on the corkboard by tomorrow morning. If they want to test your edge, we're going to show them exactly how sharp it is." She opened the heavy oak doors. She didn't look back. She walked out into the hallway, the absolute silence of the penthouse, no longer a tomb, but a kingdom waiting for her command. She asked the Mafia Boss for a divorce. 10 minutes later, every exit was locked. A week later, she owned the locks. When the cage door finally opened, Claire didn't fly away, she took over the prison. The line between captive and queen is razor thin, and sometimes the only way to survive the darkness is to learn how to rule it. What do you think about Claire's ultimate choice? Did she surrender to the toxicity, or did she finally take back her power? Let us know in the comments below. If you couldn't look away from this dark romance, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more intense, unhinged storytelling. See you in the next one.